Hello everybody. So we are moving into the last couple of weeks of our course, and we're going to take a look at Standard 6 for this last couple of weeks. Standard 6, or ELCC Standard 6, as you can see here, states candidates who complete the program are educational leaders who have the knowledge and ability to promote the success of all students by understanding, responding to, and influencing the larger political, social, economic, legal, and cultural context. So with that said, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this idea of being able to understand and respond to this larger political, social, and economic, legal, and cultural context. We're not going to deal with the influencing right now per se. This presentation is going to look at policy and politics and how those two things play together, and how you as an administrator need to be aware of some basic ideas that are happening. You know, let's say, for example, you hear somebody come up and say, let's take, for instance, something that was just recently on the state question that failed, and that was the idea of basically allowing school districts to use bond money for things beyond building and transportation, which is what the law is in Oklahoma right now. And so on the surface, you think, wow, that could be a good thing. But when you dig a little bit deeper into that, what you find when you dig deeper into that is you realize that what that could actually do is widen the divide between wealthy and poor districts in the state. And those districts that have the bonding capacity could pass a bond or series bonds, and you suddenly find a district that's paying significantly above the state minimum compared to many rural districts that don't have bonding capacity and could never do that and are only paying the minimum. And what happens is your quality of teachers move away from the rural areas into those more urban areas or those wealthy districts. There are some rural districts that are wealthy depending on where you are in the state. But you see that on the surface, it might sound like a good idea, but in the larger context, what that is really an equitable way of funding schools. And so I use that as an example because you need to be able to look at politics and policy and understand what's being said and how you can respond to that. Okay, and so all that fits right in with Standard 6, that example there. And so that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at policy, and then we're going to move into politics in general. And now some of this is going to be kind of out and about a little bit, so there's not a lot of hard solid stuff in this, but it's ideas that influence people. Okay, and just going back to that example, understanding the idea behind what would happen if we allowed that to take place, not to mention the fact that, in my opinion, allowing school districts to do that would relieve pressure from the state to adequately fund education, because we know that a lot of the significant majority of any school budget goes to salaries. And so if that is taken away from the state and placed at the local level, then the state that has not done practically anything until very recently on school funding will do even less. So understanding all that is what this standard deals with. So looking at a historical perspective on policy. So as far as policy is concerned, what is the importance of the following terms and events? So I'm just going to list some things here. Brown versus Board of Education was 1954. differentiated curriculum. Sputnik was launched in 1957. We'll go through these and then we'll talk a little bit about them. Equity really could probably be at the end. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Today, you know that as ESSA. Every Student Succeeds. It used to be called No Child Left Behind. And so when we hear, this is going to bring in socioeconomic. This is your Title I programs. Okay? We'll come back to the politics about that a little bit. Public Law 94-142, IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act in the 70s. ESEA, by the way, was 64-65 under Lyndon Johnson. Accountability comes into play, A Nation at Risk, this is 1982. Data-driven decision-making and English language learners, these come up starting in the 70s, but really coming up more since then. So you can see all these things. Really, we should update that 50 years to about 60 years. But all these things are showing how policy has been forced to change. And in some ways, what we see are laws being changed, but policy lagging behind. So when we take all these things together, obviously what we see here, combination of Brown, English language learners, the big case for that was in the early 70s. Elementary and Secondary Education Act in the 60s, IDEA in the 70s. What we started realizing is that we had to start looking at individual students, and we could not take this holistic look at education anymore. And so really, I said that all this brought equity down to the bottom, and really equity should be the overarch here. All this deals with equity, and how we deal with equity in policy is problematic, because we don't do as good of a job as we could. Those of you who've had finance understand what we talk about equity. When we look at the finance formula in Oklahoma, it is one of the more equitable formulas in the country. Many states do similar formulas that we do, but there was just some recent discussion this year on revising the funding formula. But all of it has to do with equity. All of it goes back to data-driven decision. And all these things are a result of these major events that happened in American history in the last 60 years or so. Okay, so what we see is we're starting to look a little bit closer at individuals as opposed to the holistic approach of how a school is doing. And of course, we know now, we've been in this mindset long enough that we know that by taking this more individualistic look, what we see is that on the surface we may feel like we're doing well, but when we start looking underneath into these subgroups, that there are some subgroups that are not doing nearly as well. And so that again brings in the issue of equity. How do we treat them and work with these groups to get them at least to where their peers are? So we'll cover more of this, but that's just some perspective. So when we talk about policy, what is policy? So here's a brief definition: a political process where needs, goals, and intentions are translated into a set of objectives, laws, policies, and programs, which in turn affect resource allocation, actions, and outputs, which are the basis for evaluation, reforms, and new policies. To put it in a visual, many of you have heard me say I like visuals. This is how policy works, and you can think of this on a state level, on a national level, but you can also think of this on a school level. And so you can see here what we do is we take our needs and goals, we change those and put them into objectives, policies, and programs. So think of this process in your school. You have a need, you have a sudden increase over the last 10 years of ELL students, and now you have a significant group that's being measured, and you're able to see the data, and those data show that your ELL population is performing lower than your others. So now you have a need. So you change that into policy, create some objectives, create a program. Maybe it's going to be the first time your school has an ESL program. And then you take that and turn it into resource allocation outputs. How are we going to evaluate the effectiveness of our program based upon the policies that we've created and the resources we have? And then based on that evaluation, we go around and we restart the cycle. What are our needs? Are the needs still the same? Have they grown worse? So this is how policy is created at all levels. But probably the easiest to understand is to think about board policy and at the most local level, your school district itself. Okay? So then what does the role of the principal become when we're talking about policy? So whether this is state policy, and really in education for the most part, you're going to be dealing with states. Of course, as you know, our federal dollars equal about 10% of an average school budget in Oklahoma. So most of what we're dealing with in policy really is state, and local meaning your school board policy. So as a principal, one of the things you need to do is simply orient yourself to the policy. You need to know what the policy says, okay? And it's okay to have an opinion on that policy, because you're becoming a leader in a position that has impact on how you negotiate and advocate for policies. And keep in mind, this goes back to what we said earlier when we started this presentation, these historical changes that have happened. Are we seeing them reflected in policy? Are we seeing this cycle here of the needs being translated into policies and programs, being allocated through resources and outputs, and then evaluated? Is that happening based upon what we see in education? And if not, then you're in a position now where you can start impacting those developments. So the degree to which you oppose or support the policies you have after you've oriented them, how many or how much resources are needed to inform, implement, and influence policy. As a new principal or even an AP, you may not feel that you have that much resource, but in time you'll get it. How do you actually go about supporting or opposing policies? Where does autonomy play a role in this? You as the leader of your building, and oversight that comes from central office. Where is the autonomy in how you translate policies? What does society say? We're going to talk about a society in a minute. And how does your vision and mission that you have created for your school compare when you're looking at board policies, and how do you deal with that? Why do you believe the things you do? So let's say you oppose something or feel that it doesn't do enough. Why is it that you feel that way? And this loops all the way back to our very first assignment when we talked about you as a leader, and then the feedback I gave all of you. Part of the feedback was the same, that keep those keys to leadership that you wrote, and as you gain leadership experience, those things will mature over time. Okay. And then finally, the last thing here, your role of principal, is a power relationship. Who in your circle now, because you have a new circle, who in this circle do you work with when you come up against policy that you either disagree with or agree with and want to enhance, and so forth. So again, the key to all this is that orientation piece as well. You've got to understand what it is that you have. So when looking at policy as an entity, as a thing, there are some lenses that you're going to look at the policy, okay? And this is where I said this gets a little bit theoretical, so just bear with me here, but we want to talk about how we're going to analyze policy. So for example, systems theory. This provides a holistic approach in how policy affects the system. So when you're looking at policy, you initially are going to look at it and think, how does this impact my school and my students? But I want you to be able to broaden your horizon and think of it as a systems approach to policy. How does this policy impact the system as a whole, not just my elementary school or my middle school? How does this impact all middle schools and then the district as a whole? Okay, and what you often find when you do that is you start to see the particularities of your site versus another, and sometimes how difficult it is to create policy that addresses one's individual site completely. And so when you're looking at systems theory or looking at policy through a systems theory perspective, what you have to do is think about how the whole system is impacted by the policy. Another lens to view policy is the Neo-Pluralistic Advocacy Coalition, or interest group theories. We're looking more probably at state policy, what state statutes say. And these are groups such as COSA, okay? And so COSA looks at policies from an advocacy group or an interest group theory. And they interpret policy from that angle, advocating for schools as a whole, okay? Another way to look at policy, or another lens through which you can view policy, is the neo-institutional theory. And this is working with policymakers to determine the impact of policy or policy decisions. So you can play your role as a principal and work through policy through this theory. This would be possibly attending fall interim studies. So the way our system of government is set up in Oklahoma, we have, obviously we have session in the spring, and then in the summer and fall we have a number of interim studies going on that help determine what the next session is going to be about, the major things. And so during those interim studies, education, of course, is a big issue because it takes a third of the state budget. And so it's in these areas that you could go and work with policymakers, obviously, and do that. Of course, you can be an advocate during the session and go work with policymakers and explain how policies impact school and education in general. Okay? So you see how these different theoretical lenses help define how one may view policy as opposed to another. Critical theory lens is really questioning the status quo. It says oriented to disenfranchised groups. This is looking at policy from that critical perspective, as the name implies, and looking at more of the subgroups. Okay, it brings in that equity piece, and how does this policy impact these disenfranchised groups? That question about the bonds and so forth could fall under critical theory here. It could fall under a lot of these, but looking at that policy through critical theory is saying that, hey, by allowing districts to create bonds, sell bonds, that could fund things such as instruction is really going to disenfranchise those poor rural districts even more than they already are. Okay, it's an example of critical theory. Feminist theory relating to gender and sexual differences. This would be looking at policy in that way. Title IX, federal policy, is a prime example of looking at policy from a feminist theory. These theories, by the way, are within the last 20, 30 years or so. Postmodernism is policy only has meaning with those that create it. Policy is used to perpetuate the highly racist, sexist, and class nature. So postmodernists would work in Oklahoma and really have a lot of discussion and angst over the state legislature. As it says here, they view policy as being having meaning to those who are creating it. And so in essence what you're saying is if they're not looking at equity, then there's no interest in equity. And while they may feel that it's important and it's doing what it's doing, they're limiting their view on the impact that it could have. And the last one we're going to look at is ideological theories, and this is looking at policy from very ideological perspectives. And an example of this is the American Legislative Exchange Council. This is an organization that has really grown up in the last 40 years or so. And I'm not going to play this YouTube video, but I would encourage you to watch it. You have a copy of this PowerPoint in the module. And it talks about the American Legislative Exchange Council and the role that this organization is playing in public education. So then the question that comes to mind is what different insights regarding policy can be gleaned from each of the mentioned theories? Why is it important for a principal to have a working knowledge of these theories? And what are the practical applications of these theories? So let me just give you an example of how this comes into play. We talk about the third grade reading test in Oklahoma, and we've had many people criticize that. And I remember when we first started doing it, I was working with a colleague out of Arizona, and I mentioned this, and she said, well, we have the same thing in Arizona. So without knowing much about it, I started doing some research and learned that this was a law that was put forth by ALEC, that ideological theory. So we can view it through that lens. Okay. We can also view it through the lens of critical theory and looking at what is this doing for low-income students. And so we can look at a law through different lenses and see. So on the surface, we may think this is a good idea, but once we start looking at it through these different lenses, what we see there are problems that we may find in it, and the intent may not be what it is on the surface. So that's the answer to our question, why is it important for you as a principal? You are supposed to be an advocate for your students, faculty, and your district and education as a whole. And whether you want to or not, this is a role that you have been put in. And so to make an effective space in your world and in the profession, understanding this is going to help you, okay? So that's why we look at policies. Now, again, just a little bit deeper here, dimensions of policy. These are some frameworks. Again, we can view these through, it's just one more step down from what we were looking at earlier. We can view policy through the beliefs, values, and ideologies that drive the decisions that create those policies. the third grade reading test. On the one hand, we can say public education is not educating our students, educating our workforce enough to come in and fulfill the technical jobs that are being created, and so therefore we need to increase the rigor in our schools, and so that's how we come up with that. So that would be an example of a normative dimension, viewing that law. Structural dimension, reflection of the motivation, needs, and objective expressed by political ideas and ideologies. So looking at that same law through this lens, you might come out and say, actually though, what this is doing is it's punishing poor kids in poor schools. Okay? So you can see how we can look at the same law through different frameworks here, and based upon that, we're going to come up with different ideas. The constitutive dimension, constituent groups either favor or oppose the politics. Developed, why would somebody, to take it to the extreme positive, obviously we want to enhance student learning and make for a better society, so that's why we need a law like the third grade reading law. But on the other end of that spectrum, we could say, instead of doing that third grade reading law, why don't we enhance interventions and institute more pre-K and early childhood education, and avoid the third grade reading, you don't pass, you stay in third grade, because all this does is make public education look bad. Okay, so you can see how, depending on which constituent group we're talking about, we can go from one end of the spectrum to the other. And then finally, the technical dimension. This includes the educational planning, practice, implementation, and evaluation, the nuts and bolts of policy making. What are the technical ramifications of passing a law that says every student has to pass their third grade reading exam? So, like I said, that's a lot. We looked at theories through which we can view policy making, how to analyze policy, and we looked at frameworks of how we can, again, a little bit deeper and analyze policy. Now we're going to talk about politics in the last couple of slides here. Politics is important here because, as a principle, you need to understand that politics plays an important role in your job as the principal and the community, your school, the larger community, and then education in general. Okay, so which of Apple's groups would you place yourself in? Apple is an author that comes out of the book that we used to use for this course. The majority of teachers and your staff at your school. So where would you put yourself in this group? Where would you put your teachers and staff at your school? Which group? Which group would you place the stakeholders in your community? And then why is it important to identify these groups? So let's look at these groups real fast. So first one here is a neoliberal group. This relating school dollars and even more marketing schools with voucher plans and tax credits. The neoconservative group, deeply committed to establishing tighter mechanisms of control over knowledge, morals, values through national state curricula and national or state mandated testing. Authoritarian populists believe in a pedagogy that is based on traditional relations to authority, where the teachers and adults are always in control. They believe biblical authority should always supersede public policy. That's your authoritarian populist. Upward mobile professionals, they control at a distance through testing, through cost-benefit analysis, and so on. And then finally, your thick-visioned Democrats, issues of power involving local decision-making, responding to local needs, histories, and cultures of oppressed people, people of color, and low SES. They advocate for a socially responsive pedagogy. So thinking of these things, one of the main driving forces here you can see is how dollars are used in these groups, whether you're a neoliberal and looking at vouchers and tax credits, a neoconservative and wanting to control the state curriculum, mandated testing, the authoritarian populists, the upward mobile professionals, or the thick-visioned Democrats. Understanding where you are and understanding where your teachers are and where your community is going to help you navigate through those, I wouldn't say difficult decisions. It will help you navigate through typical discussions that are going to come up about your role as an administrator and the role of public education, because I promise you those things will come up as your principal. So how do you deal with it then? How do you deal with the educational politics? There's a term we use called pluralistic maintenance politics. Maintain what is there, good for good schools, but change requires a different approach. Basically, this is more that status quo thing. Adversarial politics. Think of yourself as a leader and how you're going to approach policy and politics and all, and where do you fit into these. Those who would fall into this adversarial politics, under education, they focus only on short-term goals. Opposing groups, they tend to personalize events. Items are defined as one group against another. Okay. The democratic politics, this is a transitional state. We're all in a transitional state. This is when all stakeholders get to voice their ideas, good for deep change, but not for the day-to-day activities. This is it's interesting to look at these things and compare K-12 to higher ed, because this, I would say higher ed is for the most part really into this democratic politics. Is how politics is handled in education and higher ed. We try to give, at least in our college, we try to give everybody input and then take all those inputs into consideration. And change is slow in higher ed. It's a very slow process. And so that's why it says it's not good for the day-to-day activities. There's a lot going on when you're getting input from all your stakeholders wanting to hear their voice. On the other side of that, though, you would see, oops, wrong. Those short-term goals, more of the adversarial, and so focusing on those short-term goals, being more of a adversarial / consolidated power kind of person is on one end, where that democratic politics is on the other end. And so we see change happening in those two ends of the spectrum, but how quickly is change happening and who's involved in that change is the question here. And that pluralistic maintenance piece comes in when everything is good and we don't want to change. Okay, so think about these ideas as you see people, and where would you put them in the way they handle um, politics and education. Are they change makers? Are they not change makers? Um, how do they want change if they are change makers? Do they want input from everybody? Are they more authoritarian? Are they more adversarial? Those kinds of things. The last two here, unitary politics, shared set of values to guide day-to-day activities, strong relational ethics, small, stable communities. This is probably what you'd find very much in rural schools. If you find it in larger urban and suburban schools, it's probably in a silo effect type of school. And then the last one there is that consolidated principal power. So the last slide then is how do we make this all work? And this really is going toward those as a superintendent, leading the whole district. And I would say that if you talk to effective superintendents, this is what you're going to see. And they support what is called synergistic leadership theory. The idea of synergy is that we're all stronger and more productive as a group than we are as a collective of individuals. And so synergistic leadership theory is kind of, I don't know that it's a combination of these types of politics. You really work with everybody together. You work with them where they are, and you work with them whatever their educational political idea is. You work with them there, and you get input from them. And by doing that, you get their buy-in wherever they are on that spectrum. Okay, and the whole team is moving as a team, as opposed to moving in an autocratic fashion or so bogged down with trying to get input from every single individual stakeholder. This synergistic leadership theory allows you to work with all variables in the system toward a common goal. So, again, lots of straightforward terms here. Organizing it in your mind is going to help you understand it better. The big takeaway I hope you get from this is that even in education, and we all call ourselves teachers, we come at education with different political ideas. Those political ideas influence the way we do our job and the way we interpret policy or state law or board policy, whatever it may be, and how we implement that into our job. And all this goes back to the very first slide where we were talking about the changes that have happened in the last 60 years, and really the biggest changes that need for equity in education. And so to kind of start wrapping around back to the beginning of our course, if we believe that all students can learn, and when we were talking about visions at the beginning of our course, we had that most of us said all students can learn. This is where we're starting to look at ourselves in this standard and what our beliefs are, what our attitudes and values are, and how are we going to take those things and be that advocate for all children to learn. And it may mean that we have to change some of our values and beliefs and attitudes, and that's a good thing. It just means we're still maturing. So anyway, with that, I wish you the best.